Hey, it's Alan. I get asked all the time, how exactly does Kadima help people? There are three primary ways. One, we provide one-on-one personalized career coaching with a focus on getting you a great job. Two, we provide an online do-it-yourself course where you can work at your own pace. Three, if you have a job offer, we'll help you negotiate for more. So to find out about these great services and everything else that we offer at Kadima, sign up for our newsletter. Go to syckpodcast.com. That's SYCK podcast.com. I promise you, it'll be the best newsletter to accelerate your career. Thanks a lot.
Live from Brooklyn, welcome to the Sick Podcast, starring Alan Stein, where he steers your career with Kadima. Along with Alan, I'm Russ Reba, and big, hairy problems. No, she's not a plumber that extracts the gunk out of your shower drain. She solves much bigger problems. Alan's interview today is not to be missed. Alan, I don't want to hear about your big, hairy problems, but I'd love the audience to get a sneak peek into some fun, non-work-related stuff that you got into this past week.
Yeah, Russ. So my boys are busy studying for their SATs, and they're going to their junior year. So I am busy making plans on how to get them to different testing sites because they are actually testing the first electronic SAT or the digital SAT. And I need to drive their asses out to Staten Island, which for people that are not familiar, I think I'm going to have to pay $11 each way to get to and from that island. But I guess that's what you do for your kids, right?
Absolutely. I just drove my son to his SAT prep class. He's got 8 sessions on his day off. He gets 1 day off a week at the school he goes to, plus weekends, and he's got his SAT prep. So I'm right there with you with us having boys the same age.
The interesting thing about the SAT is it's totally a learnable skill. I was really shitty the first time I took my PSAT back, 30, 40 years ago. And through classes and tutoring, I was able to increase my score by 320 points, which just goes to show how biased the test is because some people can afford those tutors, some people cannot, and also is very aligned with the job search process. All of this stuff is learnable. And it's just about getting the resources, getting the insight, and figuring out how to play the game.
All right, so it's worth the $11 to get over. Is it the ferry that costs that much?
It's the bridge, the Verrazano Bridge, each way.
Okay, well, it's worth it. All right, so let's get into this Sick Podcast with Naama Bloom.
I worked with Naama during my time at American Express. We crossed paths there. I saw her amazing career beyond there. She put out some really great commercials. I mean, we'll talk about that with Hello Flow, which is just some of the video content that you produced there was fantastic. And we've stayed in contact. We're in the same nearby neighborhood. And she has tons of wisdom to share with the sick crowd here, the Steer Your Career with Kadima crowd. So Naama, before I introduce you further, love to hear how you would describe yourself and just want to welcome you to the podcast here.
Thanks, Alan. I'm excited to be here. How I would describe myself, I think from a career perspective, I would describe myself as a marketer. I'm currently the chief marketing officer of a fintech company called True Accord, but work is just a small part of what I do. So also a friend, sister, daughter, mother, wife, and those are big parts of my life also.
Awesome. And we'll go through some of your life choices, but according to the LinkedIn profile that you wrote, you said coworkers and colleagues tell you you're the one they seek out to solve big, hairy problems and make things happen. So I'm assuming that occurs often. What are some of the big, hairy problems that you solve on a daily basis?
I mean, I would say in general, I'm actually attracted to those problems, which might be why people seek me out to solve them. I think one of the things I do, and maybe you remember this from when we worked together, but I ask a ton of questions, much to the frustration of past teachers and coworkers. And I just always want to get to the bottom of why things happen the way they do. And so I think that sort of curiosity for understanding why things work and why things happen the way they do just sort of makes me gravitate towards big problems. I mean, today, part of why I joined True Court and what I love about this job is, we're in the debt collection space, which is not a space that I was necessarily seeking out, but it's a space that's really messy and I feel like needs to change quite a bit, but it's highly complex. It's highly regulated. There are consumers on one end and creditors on the other end and collection agencies in the middle and software producers, and figuring out how to make all of those pieces work and also actually treat the end user, those consumers, with a level of humanity that they're not used to experiencing when dealing with this problem. Just seemed like a really big, hairy, meaty problem that you couldn't solve overnight. So that was part of what I was drawn to.
Nice. And before we get to where you are currently, you graduated about the same time I did. I graduated in 95. Looks like you graduated from Wisconsin in 94.
Yep.
What did you do after you graduated? I'm looking at your LinkedIn profile. The first thing on your LinkedIn profile is at CBS. But what did you do and that was in 1997. What did you do between 94 and 97?
So I studied film studies in undergrad, very liberal artsy, and I thought I wanted to make documentaries when I grew up. So after college, first I stayed in Wisconsin for a few months and worked as a nanny and saved up some money. And then I packed up my car and I drove to Los Angeles and really had no plans other than to get a job in the entertainment industry. And I had friends of a friend of a friend's place to stay for the first 3 days when I got there. And everything else was basically figure it out as I go along. And so I ended up doing a lot of freelance production work. I was a production assistant on a TV show, on a few commercials. I was a stand-in in a commercial. I mean, I basically did any job that would pay me money. And then I ended up ultimately, before CBS, the job that I had was working as an assistant for a Hollywood production company. And I did that for about a year and a half. And then I got the job at CBS, and that was also an assistant job, which, for people who have worked in Hollywood, the assistant job, you're basically a secretary with aspirations to advance. And you do a lot of administrative stuff, and then all the extra stuff like reading scripts and writing coverage, which is descriptions of scripts. And after I think I turned 25 and I decided maybe this isn't the life I want, and I wanted to be back in New York where I was from. And again, I left my job, drove across the country, or actually I might have flown at that point, and waited tables before I went back to CBS and worked for CBSnews.com. And then I kind of was off into the races in this sort of .com world. In the late 90s, I worked at probably 6 different .coms. They all ran out of money and had different levels of success. And then realized I didn't want to keep working for companies that were going to run out of money. So I went back to business school.
Nice. And how did you get that first job at CBS?
How did I get that first job at CBS? It was before the internet, early internet, I should say. So I don't know, there must have been I don't even know how I found out about jobs back then. There must have been postings in the back of Variety or something. Right. And I was faxing my resume to people, faxing resumes, probably 10 a day. And then somehow I got the interview at CBS and I somehow convinced them to hire me. But, it was, faxing and calling and sending cover letters and thank you notes through the mail. It was, old school, no email.
What was your thought process that had you leave media and the startup space to go to business school?
Well, I was working for these startups and I was doing pretty well at them. And I noticed that I had a knack for solving problems, but everyone who had the senior level jobs at these companies had business degrees or had a business undergrad degree or had gone to some fancy college and I just felt like I didn't have that. And at the same time, I was also seeing a lot of the companies I was working for hiring consultants. And I thought, oh, that's so interesting. You get to like come into a company and solve a problem and then basically deliver the solution and, tap out. And I thought, wow, that could be kind of a fun job too. And, I realized the way to get the jobs that I wanted was to have a business degree. So, I had done the starving artist thing in Hollywood. And then when I first moved back and I realized like, I didn't want to be broke forever. And I felt like if I went down the creative path that I had originally thought I wanted to go down, it was going to be very hard. So
you went to business school thinking that you might have gone the consulting path after business school, or that was one of your thoughts?
Yeah, that was definitely one of my thoughts was, I'll go to business school, then I'll go work at a consulting firm and I'll travel and show up at companies and think big thoughts and get to leave before any of the work happened. I know that's not really what consultants do, but that was my observation prior working closely with consultants. And yeah, when I got there, I was like a kid in a candy store. Like the companies come and they present, different companies that are recruiting come and they have these like evening briefing sessions where they present information about their companies and the different jobs. And like, I went to so many of them and I kind of couldn't believe how many different jobs like existed that I'd never heard of. And I became really friendly with this woman in my business school class, and I was describing all the things I'd like to do. And she was like, well, actually, I think what you want to do is marketing, because she had done marketing before business school. And, the more I learned about it, the more I realized like, oh yeah, this actually like it suits me and it makes sense for what I want to do. So
what were some of those things that you communicated to her that allowed her to kind of match you to a marketing career? What were some of those aspects that entice you or excite you?
It had a lot to do with the fact that I liked the, kind of combination of left brain, right brain activity. Like I am drawn to creative pursuits, but I also am very focused on numbers and analysis. And also this like idea of this, like the enjoying being like in a hub and spoke model and having all these different elements working together and sort of synchronizing a lot of different pieces of work to come together to make like one big thing happen. So it's very, it's like a very prototypical like marketing manager type of thing.
Mm-hmm. So you're at Cornell, one of the top business schools in the country, if not the world. And it sounds like a lot of these companies were coming up to Ithaca. Mm-hmm. To share all the bells and whistles about their organizations. Do you remember some of the companies that came up there to present to you?
Yeah. By the time I got really serious, it was mostly the consulting firms and the CPG, the consumer packaged goods companies. So like the Johnson & Johnson's and P&G and SC Johnson. I was like very enamored about that. And then, interestingly, my first year I was there like a week after I got to school, it was 9/11. So like a lot of companies, it was 9/11 and then there was like a financial meltdown. Yep. So a lot of companies diverted recruiting, and like right before, like at the very last minute, American Express said like, we're going to come up and we're going to continue doing recruiting. And I went to the briefing and I saw the people and then I met some of the people and I was like, oh, like culturally, these people seem more like my people. Yeah. And I can't really explain it. And it's such a ridiculous, this is going to sound so like simplistic and catty, but I had an offer at a CPG firm to do the summer internship. And when I thought about everyone there, I was like, they all wear pastel sweater sets, and the New Yorkers are like dressed in black and like more stylish. And I'm like a single person. And am I really going to move into like suburban New Jersey and start wearing pastel sweater sets? Or should I like be in New York City where I lived before and I know people And just like, I don't know, culturally, it seemed more who I was. Not that I make job decisions based on fashion, and like, me, I'm not obsessed with fashion, but it was just like there was this suburban feeling that came from the CPG firm. And I just thought like, that's not where I am right now.
Yeah. So did you intern at Amex?
I did. I interned at Amex, and then they made me an offer. And, if you went to business school, right, Alan?
I did. I went to Columbia. Yeah.
Yeah. So like if you go your second year, if you have an offer, there's something like really compelling about enjoying the second year of grad school without having to look for a job. And I had a really good experience at Amex, and I felt like I could enjoy being there. And I thought, I assumed I'd be there for 2 or 3 years. I didn't expect to be there for almost 9, but it seemed like a pretty solid place to go after school.
And I'm looking at your Amex career. You started there as a manager or as a senior manager?
Manager.
And then you got promoted to senior manager, product management, then customer acquisition, which for most normal people is sales, just selling plastic. You're acquiring new customers. Then director of brand strategy, then director of loyalty and growth.
Yeah.
Talk about, so you were there for 8 years. You got promoted from manager to senior manager and senior manager to director. So you got promoted twice over 8 years, and you got 4 or 5 different experiences. How much was that driven by you? How much of that just came to you? And talk about your decision-making process over that 8+ years at American Express.
I would say in the beginning, the promotions were driven by the company more. Like the manager to senior manager was almost like you were almost part of a class. Like everyone who was staying, it wasn't like everyone got promoted at the same time, but it was like around the same time. Yeah. It was like assumed that within 12 to 18 months, if you came in with an MBA, you would be promoted, assuming you did an okay job. The director job for me was quite unusual because it was a new director job and they hadn't had a director position there. But I had basically molded my acquisition job. I had launched a bunch of new programs that were pretty innovative for the company and that were very focused on actually building brand for Open, which was the small business card, where we both worked. And the programs I launched were pretty successful. And if they were going to scale and they were going to keep going, there needed to be people actually focused just on those. So I kind of convinced them that they needed to have a director of brand to do these experiential marketing events, which was what I had been originally doing. So like big live events and actually like streaming and creating an online forum, like all of that stuff just didn't exist. And I knew it needed to exist. And we had sort of first indicators that it was working. And since no one else had done it but me, there was like no one that they could obviously give that job to because like it was a new space that no one really had experience in. So I convinced them to make that job, which in hindsight was like pretty ballsy of me for even putting it out there and like actually kind of shocking that they did it, because the reason why I ended up ultimately leaving the company is because when it was, quote, my time to get promoted to VP, I couldn't get promoted to save my life. Like everyone was always in front of me in line. Like even if I had the most qualifications, I wasn't going to get it because there was like a line of people waiting to be promoted. And I just didn't really have the patience for it, quite honestly. And I felt like, sure, if I stayed, eventually I would probably get promoted, but I would get incredibly frustrated along the way.
Yeah.
And I would say, like, in hindsight, and, I've thought about this a lot since then, I should have left Amex after 5 years. I definitely stayed too long because the last couple of years, I wasn't really growing much anymore. I was more just getting frustrated.
Yeah. And so it took you about 3 years to get to that frustration point. where you actually made a change? Was there a tipping point, or like,
yeah, I mean, during
like the challenge of getting promoted from a director, which is band 40, to a VP, which is band 45? And they're like, it's big deal here, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
But like, was there a tipping point, or what were some of the leading factors that said, okay, I'm getting the hell out of here?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think I was pretty much ready to get the hell out of there at year 5, but then I got married and I had one child, and then I had another child, and it was like kind of easier to stay than to go somewhere and like have to just like be an absolute gunner all over again to prove myself. So that was like definitely one consideration is, you know, if you want to have a family and if you want to actually like spend time with your babies when they're little and you want to have some semblance of balance, it's much easier to pull that off if you've been working for somewhere for like 5 or 6 years and you have a proven track record of success and you don't have people breathing down your neck on like about the hours you're physically there or not. So that was one major consideration for me. And it wasn't necessarily, I don't think I was necessarily super aware of it as much as my motivation for switching jobs decreased when my motivation for like spending time at home increased. So there was a little bit of that. Before I had my second child, I knew that I shouldn't stay anymore. Like I was just like deeply unhappy there. And I, you know, at the time it was 12 weeks leave. I took the 12 weeks leave and I added another 4 weeks of PTO. And I basically made the decision that I was going to spend my leave getting a new job. And I mean, I like flew to California multiple times for interviews during my leave. Like I was pumping in the bathroom, like pumping after interviews. Like it was insane. I mean, I was like 6 weeks postpartum. I was like traveling all over, interviewing for jobs. And I actually had an offer at Google, like before the leave ended, and they wanted me to move to California. And I didn't want to move to California. And I had another offer at a software company in New York. And so I ended up taking that job instead. You know, the Google job would have been a hell of a lot more lucrative, but it would have required, you know, they were like, you could be in New York for 6 months and then you have to move. And I just knew, like, I knew that me saying that would be lying to them. Like I had no intention of moving. And I was like, well, maybe I could do it. And then just after 6 months, say I've changed my mind. It's Google. It's a big enough company. If I do well, they'll let me stay. They'll find something else. But I felt like that wasn't really being honest. So I turned that one down and I took a job at a software company, which was fine. Not great, but fine. But, you know, there were other considerations. Like my husband had a startup at the time and we were trying to balance like 2 careers growing.
But that's a sick piece of advice that you have there, because you were pretty conscious about when to move, because you were starting a family, you had young kids, that was your priority. And you're like, hey, I'm not going, you realize going to a new company, a new organization would be more stressful on your time and resources and getting up to speed. So you're like, so you plan that pretty strategically to balance your life, it sounds like.
Yeah. I mean, I think this goes for men and women, and it's like what your priorities, especially with regard to your career, change. Like things wax and wane throughout your career. And so there's different jobs that are appropriate at different times. You know, I think the other thing is like now, I've been working longer and I have a different level of, I guess, seniority when I come and join a company at this point. And I have like a different track record, and I have, I've been working for 20 something years. So I have savings. I have like a different level of flexibility so that I could still say my family is my priority, and I can establish different boundaries when I enter a job. But like, I'm turning 50 this year and I finally can do that. Like I couldn't do that after working for 10 years. You can't like walk in. I mean, maybe you can now, but I didn't feel then that I could walk into a new job where it was going to be an advancement in my position and say like, okay, here's what you have to know about me. Like, I'll be good at my job, but I need to leave at 5. I'll get back on at 7. But, like I didn't have the confidence that I could pull that kind of communication off.
Yeah. Now with COVID and everyone working from home, it's a little bit different, but I can imagine it's still being very challenging.
Yeah.
And so you went to Harvest, that startup. And I know you also started a company, Hello Flow.
Yep.
And looking at your LinkedIn profile, you started that while you were still at Harvest. Is that true?
Yes. So,
So talk about that.
Yeah, so I was at Harvest for about 1.5 years, and I had this idea for Hello Flow, which was originally a subscription service for women and girls for their period, really focusing specifically on puberty and different women's health milestones. It eventually was like puberty, postpartum, menopause. But I had the idea while I was at Harvest. I actually told the founders of Harvest that I was working on this side gig because I felt that they should know, they were founders themselves. I felt they would understand it. And at a certain point, it just didn't really make sense for me to be at Harvest, not because Hello Flow was doing anything great back then, but just, we were not spiritually aligned with how to run marketing there, and made the decision, we separated, we parted ways, and I did a bunch of contract work for people who I had worked with in the past, either at Amex. And then I had met these other people who hired me to be the interim CMO of this health company. And I was doing probably 25 hours a week of paid work. And then I was also building Hello Flow on the side. And it was actually perfect because I had flexibility. I was creatively inspired. And then I was ready to launch Hello Flow, and I made this video you mentioned earlier. And the job where I was the part-time CMO, I said to them, listen, I'm launching my company. I'm going to take a week off because I have all this launch activities, and it's just going to suck up my time. And we launched this video, and it went viral. And basically I never went back to that other company because it all of a sudden, overnight, turned into more than a full-time job. And, then I went down this completely different path of trying to fundraise and trying to build a business. And that was 6 years, 7 years. It was, felt like 100.
Yeah. Give our listeners a little description of the commercial and what happened to you after the commercial. I saw it on YouTube. I think several people had shared it with me before I even heard, even knew it was associated with you.
Yeah. So the first video was called Camp Gyno, and it was about a girl who's the first in her sleepaway camp to get her period. And she basically decides to educate all the other girls. And, it was meant to be a farcical cautionary tale for parents that basically explained, if you don't talk to your kids, they're going to get this information somewhere else. So get a backbone and talk to your kids, basically. But it was unapologetic and lacking shame about menstruation. And as a result, just achieved a level of virality that I could not have predicted. I did not realize that the world was so craving straight talk about women's health. And then it really just pushed the company and my career actually into this place of creating content around women's health and really just trying to, get conversations around things where people are, have a certain level of shame into the forefront.
Nice. And so you're more of an analytical marketer. Did you come up with that creative idea, or how was that? It was a fantastic commercial, and we'll put a link to it in our show notes. But how did that idea come out? What was your involvement in that? Did you have a great creative team? I know you have a great sense of humor, so I it felt like
it definitely. It had me in it, but it was, I had this idea that I should make a video, and my friend at the time was dating someone who's now her husband. And he was a creative at an agency, young, up and coming creative guy. And I was like, hey, can you guys come over for dinner? I have this idea and I really want to make a video, and I want to bat ideas around with you guys. And they came over, and, one of the things that you really focus on is in marketing at American Express is like really understanding the customer insights and doing the research and knowing who you're talking to. And I had done a lot of that around menstruation as I was like building the business and the idea. I spoke to like really every single woman I met. I spoke to them not just about like their experience with menstruation now, but like what it had been like as a child, and if they had kids, what it was like talking to their kids. And so, I had this couple over for dinner, my husband and I, and we ordered Thai food, and we were just sitting around the table, and I was telling this guy, Pete, like, there's just like a few universal truths of like growing up as a girl. And, I was like naming a few, and I said, like, one of them is that there's always one girl in the friend group who knows more than everyone else and who's like the person you go to. And I was telling him that for me, it was a very close friend of mine from sleepaway camp. And that like our whole lives, she was somehow like more advanced than the rest of us, like from the time we were 10 to the time we were 20, she was always like one step ahead. And so she always like, we kind of like looked up to her as someone who had more knowledge. And I was like telling him, and he said, oh, so she was like everyone's camp gyno or something. And like, as soon as he put those two words together, we were like, oh my gosh. And then, we talked about it, and then he went and spoke to his creative partner about it. And they were like, we want to write this script. And then, I would say they drove the creative, and I gave like notes on the creative, and like we worked together on the casting and all that stuff. So,
and you ran that company, then you were eventually acquired. What was your thought process? Were you shopping around? You were tired of running it?
Yeah.
Or were you approached?
I was exhausted, and the business had morphed into like a small media business around women's health. And I was looking at the media landscape, and it didn't look pretty for a small independent media company. It's just like, you need scale to make it work. You need a sales team. And so I really had like decided I was going to sell the business if I could. And I was introduced to, she's now the CEO of She Media, but it was She Knows Media at the time. She was the president at the time and like chief revenue officer. And I was introduced to her, and they didn't really have a strong health vertical, and they didn't have strong branded content. And, that was kind of what I had, plus like video experience. And so it, came together. I mean, I think I pretty much said to her, I think you should buy HelloFlow. And then, it was like a 9-month process.
Right. And then you stayed there for about a year and a half or so after the acquisition?
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah, I stayed for a year and a half. And then I was ready to leave, and a friend of mine from business school called me, and he was at Zulily, and they had just reorganized, and they had given him the chief marketing officer job. And he called me, and he was like, do you think you could do for us what you did for HelloFlow? I was like, no, but I can help. But, that was another thing where it was like wrong location. Like Zulily is an e-commerce company. It's a $2 billion business, but based in Seattle. And I was still based in New York. But I spoke to him a bunch. And finally, he was like, why don't you just fly out here and meet people? So I did, and I met people, and I thought everyone was great. But then I came home, and I was talking to my husband about it, and he was like, you're only looking for jobs outside of New York, and we have no desire to leave New York, because like other things were, I was talking to a few other companies at the time. And so I texted my friend, and I was like, loved everyone I met, but I'm not coming. I'm not moving.
Yeah.
And then he texted me a few days later and said, like, what if you didn't have to commit to living here like forever? What if it was just like 6 months or a year?
Right.
And that, and at the time they thought they were going to be opening up an office in New York City. So they were like, maybe you can be here for a year, and then you go back and you can open the office in New York and be the grown up there. Mm-hmm. So like suddenly it felt like, okay, well, it could be fun to have an adventure where we'd live somewhere else for a year. And then that turned into 2 years and, we wanted to come home.
Yeah. And you left there, you went to Puppy Spot, you became CMO, which is higher than VP marketing.
Yep.
You came back to New York. I'm guessing those were two draws to it. And I'm assuming you're a fan of dogs if you're going to go to Puppy Spot.
Yeah. I mean, I basically, it was the second year at Zulily, and I realized that there was not going to be an office in New York. I was desperate to come back. My husband also was working for a company that was headquartered in New York, but had a big office in Bellevue, which was where most of his team was. And I realized, I knew I could stay at Zulily if I was willing to come to Seattle a week every month. And I knew my husband was going to have to come to Seattle a week every month also. And I just thought, like, this is not the life I want. And so I actually told my boss, like, I'm going to leave at the end. Like, I'm going to leave with the school year, basically. I'm going to start looking now and we'll see what happens. So he had plenty of time to digest it. And I was talking to a few companies, and I had like a decision matrix of what I was looking for. Like, I was looking for a place where I could make impact, where I could get paid well, where I felt like I was doing something good. And, Puppy Spot is like really about bringing joy to people. I think you have a dog, Alan, right?
I do.
Like, yep. So, like, the dogs.
Exactly. She's right here, if you can see her.
Yes.
And then I have Coco too.
Yes, I can. But so, like, dogs bring joy into people's lives. It just like felt like a really like nice thing to do, and nice place to work, and nice, like, like a product that sells itself. But, and what Puppy Spot stands for is like transparency in the industry. Like, there are some bad breeders out there. And like what Puppy Spot does is it was like vetting the breeders so that you buy from an ethical breeder that has like great health standards and treats the puppies and the breeding dogs well. And I thought, like, okay, this feels mission-y enough for me, and it's a good opportunity. And I knew one of the investors, so like I felt like I had like a little more insight than I would going to just any small company where I didn't know anyone there. And the CEO and I had some people in common, so I was able to like do a little back channel research, and it was based here. And so it enabled me to move back. So yeah, it seemed like the right job, and I was there for 2 years. COVID happened while we were there. Had I known COVID was going to happen and we were all going to work at home all the time, I suppose I could have stayed at Zulily. But yeah, it was the right decision, but it wasn't the right job ultimately, which was why like 2 years later, one pandemic later, I was like, okay, I need to just like stop working for a little while and regroup and take some time.
Yeah. And before we get to that, though, I want to go into this other sick piece of advice that you have. And you talked about these decision variables that you had. And you mentioned you wanted to make an impact. You wanted to get paid well. You wanted to do something good. Location was obviously very critical, like a need to have.
Yeah.
And you wanted to know the people involved there. Have you always thought so rationally and thoughtfully about your career in the next role and using decision variables or understanding what's important for Naama?
I think I would say that this job I'm in now and the Puppy Spot job, it was a very like prescribed set of criteria that I was looking for. Yeah. Previously, like moving to Zulily, that was really one of the best jobs I've ever had. And, it was great because I joined the company at the right time to really like be there for some interesting changes. I worked for a good friend. I got to launch TV ads. Like I got to do a ton of stuff I'd never done before. I had a budget I could play with, like a big team. So there was that, though, just kind of worked out. That one was much more fortuitous, though it required moving.
Mm-hmm.
But I was, trying to figure out my next step after like building a business and selling the business. I kind of didn't know what to do. So I was out of practice in the like looking for a job and being thoughtful about what I'm looking for. But yes, now like with the job I have right now, I also had a list of criteria. They were different, but
yeah, and depends on the stage of your life. But what were some of the? And you said you took some time off between Puppy Spot and TrueAccord. And
yep.
I know it was a really tough time. It still is with COVID and isolation and all that type of stuff. What led you to take that time off, and how were you thinking about your next?
Well, I was trying to decide. I took the time off because I needed to get my kids back on track. Like it was a really hard year and they needed more help than we could give them working full time, both of us. And I wanted to be the one to do it. Like my husband was really enjoying his job and I was at the point where I was feeling burnt out about mine. And so it was very easy for me to say, like, I'm going to do this. But I've also played around with this idea of like, can I do some sort of contract work or do my own thing again? And I wanted time to figure out if I wanted to do that and what that would be and what it would look like. So I did it. And during the, I think it was like 7 months. During that time, I did do a bunch of consulting projects. And so I still felt like I was earning and I wasn't stressed financially because I was still able to make the money that I needed to. But yeah, I needed a pause. The other thing is like, I had been working since I was 13, like other than business school, like I had jobs all through college. I had jobs all through high school. Like I have worked my whole life. And I just really thought like, you know what? I can take a break. I'm allowed to take a break.
Yeah. And when you did take that break, what were your decision variables or what was important to you in your next role? And how did that differ than when you took the role at Puppy Spot?
So I would say like mission-driven, like purpose-driven, mission-driven organization was like number one thing I was thinking about. And also I have like, after years and years, I have a very strict no asshole policy. Mm-hmm. So like, not to say that previous companies were filled with them, but even 2%
of them just make your day terrible.
Yes. I wanted to work with people that led with like kindness and humanity, and that was built into the fabric of the company. Mm-hmm. And one of the things which is like beautiful about it is like when you go to a mission-driven company, it attracts people who want to fix things for humanity, like make things better for other people. And I think that there's not that, like, again, you're always going to have difficult people, and I have no problem with difficult people. It's more like the intention behind the difficult behavior that I really wanted to think about. Like, I think you can work with some really challenging individuals and still like feel they're really good people. And I just wanted to work with people who like were on a mission to do good and wanted to like be kind to one another while we did it.
Got it. How were you introduced to TrueAccord?
I got a recruiter call from like a recruiting company, and it was really, I was, the market's been very strong for marketers over the last year and a half. So I had gotten I'd spoken to a number of companies. Most of them were in the consumer goods space. I wasn't really talking to B2B enterprise companies, which TrueAccord has a component of, like it's the biggest part of our business. But yeah, there was something about the mission when the recruiter called that made me listen. And then I spoke to the founder and I kept listening.
Nice. And as we're wrapping up on time a little bit, mm-hmm. I hear a lot of common themes with your career path. First off, you've been working since 13. Similar to me, I was working since 14. Mm-hmm. What was your first job, by the way?
Babysitting. And then ice cream scooping.
Okay. That's a hard job. I had friends that used to work with Friendlies, and her forearm would hurt so badly by the end of the night, scooping the cold ice cream out.
Yeah.
But she did enjoy getting a lot of the free ice cream. But some of the common themes I'm hearing is the thoughtfulness of your career, the focus on your family. What else and you've had a very successful career. You started a business, you sold a business, you worked for some of the best companies in the world. What other pieces of advice what other pieces of advice would you have for people? It sounds like being thoughtful, thinking about your life, how you weigh your work-life balance. But what other advice would you have for people starting out in their careers, midpoint in their careers, any time in their career?
So I would say like one piece of super tactical advice that my sister gave me like very early on in my career, which like I mentor a lot of like young people who are just starting to work, and really good people often like gobble up work. And then all of a sudden they're like, I'm not busy enough. I don't have anything to do. And they're like almost embarrassed. They're scared to ask for more because they don't want it to seem like, I don't know what I'm doing or I'm working too fast. And one thing my sister told me years ago when I was like having that experience actually at Amex is like, no one's ever gotten fired for asking for more work. So like, if you are more efficient than other people and if you can do more, like, and you want to move faster, do more. Like, don't let yourself be taken advantage of. But I think like showing that you are competent is, there are a lot of people out there who have good jobs that are not competent, and competence is underrated. But until you have employees, in which case you're looking for competent people. So I would say like, let your competence be known. I think one of the things over time that I've learned is I think earlier on, and like probably when you and I were working together, I felt it was important to make sure my opinion was always heard and shared. I no longer feel that way. Like, I'm happy to be in a meeting and not talk at all now. If someone else says something I'm thinking about, I don't need to pile on. I just can let it ride. And I think when you have that approach, people are more likely to listen instead of tune you out. And I think like it's one of the things early in our careers that we feel like we must speak and we must be heard, so people know we're like paying attention and we're smart. But I think being thoughtful about when you speak and what you say, and being like making sure that you're showing your thoughtfulness when you share rather than just sharing is another like thing that it has taken me, 20 years of working to learn, but I feel like I finally learned it.
Have you received feedback that you added too much or weren't adding value or just talking to be heard?
I mean, I think at Amex, we got so much feedback constantly. It was like a feedback machine. So yeah, I mean, I definitely got feedback that I was too aggressive. Some of it, like we can have another podcast about like gendered feedback, but some of it was like coded, gendered. But I also had a boss at Amex that said to me once, and I'll never forget, like perception is reality. So like, it doesn't matter if the feedback is bullshit. Like if that's how people perceive you, that's the thing you have to change. So I would say, yeah, I've gotten a little bit of that feedback.
Yeah, it's interesting how within a corporate, maybe it's any company, but especially a large corporation like American Express, but I don't know how big Zulily was, but working at Google and Facebook and Salesforce, the politics exist everywhere. There's slightly different aspect to it, but you have to wonder, how am I going to be perceived here rather than focus on actually getting the shit done?
Yes.
And then it just causes so much wasted energy of what do I say and how am I perceived rather than how do I just fix this problem?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, that was ultimately why Amex long-term wasn't the right place for me. Like when I got feedback, you don't suffer fools. I was like, are we supposed to suffer fools? It's work.
Positive in my mind.
Right.
But that was probably like, oh, you need to be more patient with people.
Yes. Yeah. So, I mean, I think like also just understanding, I mean, I think you could look at that as like, sure, that should be a positive, or you could interpret that as, oh, you make people feel not smart, and so it's unmotivating. And so in that way, like, that's really good feedback for someone to have given me.
Yeah.
I can see that now in hindsight, 15 years later. At the time, I was like, aren't we supposed to work, and just like, isn't results all that matters? It's like,
yeah. So Naama, this was fantastic. And I will probably take you up on that to have a conversation specifically about the gender feedback or the whole growing in your career and being as successful as you are as a woman, and just the microaggressions, how you're perceived, being called aggressive, not suffering fools as a negative. But I'll definitely have you back for that. But The last question I like to ask my guests on Steer Your Career, and again, this is the first episode, so I'm going to start putting, this is the first episode with that title, Steer Your Career. It was formerly called Tech Swagger. But if you had, and you're giving great pieces of advice here about ask for more, take a proactive stance, any other last minute words of wisdom for people that are trying to take a proactive approach of steering their path and not waiting for things to come to them?
What has been helpful for me, and I mentioned this in the last 2 jobs, is like actually making a list of the criteria of like what's important for you. It's okay if it's money. It's okay if it's title. It's okay if it's the people you work with. But there are probably 3 or 4 things that if you sit down and think about it, you actually really care about, and you should know what those are going in, because, what's important to you might not be important to other people, but it doesn't matter because it's what's important to you. So
define your goals and identify your KPIs, what are important to you.
Yep.
Great, Naama. Well, this was an awesome conversation. I'm going to definitely put a link to the Hello Flow commercial, which everybody should see if they haven't seen it already. And if people want to follow you or reach out to you, is there a best way for people to either get in touch?
Sure. I'm on LinkedIn, and on Twitter, it's at Naama Bloom, NaamaBloom.
Awesome, Naama.
All right, I'm not going to give details, but I watched the first moon party video for Hello Flow, and I was on the floor laughing. Awesome conversation with Naama Bloom. Very special thanks to you, our listeners. Be sure to connect with Alan at sickpodcast.com. That's SYCK. On the website, click that link that says Get Our Newsletter. Alan, what can they find in the newsletter?
They can find out about our new guaranteed way to land a job in 6 months or less. And we are so confident that people will get a great job within 6 months that we're giving a money-back guarantee. So check that puppy out.
Very valuable. That's sickpodcast.com. For Alan Stein, I'm Russ Reba. We hope you've enjoyed this Sick Podcast episode with Naama, and you're going to love the next one.